Could be with us, and we're going to jump right into our study with in First Timothy. And if you remember, we were looking or listening last week to the topic of elders, and I'm going to set something up here just right. Um, and when we are talking about elders, if you remember in First Timothy chapter 3, we look at just the work of an elder. In other words, the job description and what it was all about. Because when we understand the job description or the role of an elder, we'll then be able to understand the qualifications more easily or appropriately. But we went over just verse 1 and verse 2, and that was all, where Paul tells Timothy, if someone desires, and that word aspires or desires means to reach out, trying to grab hold of. So it's not just a casual interest. This is something that someone has as a goal, as in their service to Christ. So if he desires it, he said it's a fine work. And so we emphasize what is that work? And we talked about it at length. And we'll just review just this one slide, because the role of a shepherd, remember, there's three terms to describe the same office: a shepherd, an elder, or an overseer. It's simply to lead the sheep. It's all about the sheep, the spiritual flock of God, among which elders or shepherds are overseen. And it's to lead them, it's to feed them. Of course, that's God's word, so they can grow spiritually and become more and more like Christ and start functioning as Christ and serving in his kingdom. And it's also to protect them, because remember what Paul said to the elders at Ephesus, and that's where Timothy's at. There's going to be ravage or savage wolves that are going to come in and try to devour the sheep. So the elders have got to watch out and protect them. So again, it's all about the sheep. And when we understand this fine work, he then says, therefore, an elder must be. So now he's going to give some of these character qualifications that an individual must exist if he wants to be a shepherd. And so, a couple points before we look at them. The role of a shepherd or an elder, they define or determine what the qualifications mean. The qualifications don't determine the work of the elder. And you think, well, that should be obvious. But sometimes if we don't get that clear, we're going to get lost in the qualifications of an elder, and we'll misunderstand their intent. And people even use them to disqualify a person when that's not the purpose at all. And so basically, when we look at these qualifications, since they support or define what kind of man is ready to be a shepherd, we're really just asking that question. When we're evaluating a Christian man, we're asking just this one question: is he ready to lead the flock as a shepherd? That's really the basic question. You say, well, how can you answer that? Well, we answer it by looking at different areas of his life. And so that's where we read in First Timothy chapter 3 and verse 2 through 7, a list of qualifications that Paul offers to Timothy about how to answer if a person's ready, if he's suited, if he's mature. And so that's what we want to concentrate on, that kind of approach here as we look at all of these. Is he ready to lead the sheep? Now, when we look at that, I want you to understand we got to be careful that we don't get the wrong man. He's already said in chapter 1 of verse 3 that, Timothy, you got to instruct certain men not to teach strange doctrines. He says, because there's some men that have strayed from sound doctrine and they've turned aside to fruitless discussions. Then he says in chapter 1, there have been some that suffered shipwreck to their faith. And then in chapter 4, we'll get there later, he says some will fall away from the faith, but there still be spiritual Christians, supposedly in their own mind, but they're going to pay attention to deceitful spirits and doctrines of demons, that it's going to come through the hypocrisy of liars. So he's warning them. There are going to be men in the church that you don't want to be your shepherds. He finally ends in chapter 6. If anyone advocates a different doctrine other than, that it disagrees with sound words, look what he says about that person. He is conceited. He understands nothing. He has morbid interest in controversial questions and disputes about words. And this is only at the church at Ephesus. Now, Paul already told the Ephesian elders in Acts 20 and verse 28 and 29, even among yourselves, men will rise up speaking perverse things. It was too late in their case. Some of the elders were going to apostatize. So why do we have qualifications? We want the right person, because the wrong person can do more damage than good. And we've seen that in congregations throughout maybe your spiritual history as a Christian. So when we consider these, that's why we're doing that. We want the man that God wants to be fulfill this office. All right. So with that as a background, we look at the qualifications that are in First Timothy. I just showed you the list of them. Now we're going to go through them. Now, as you most all know, this Titus is also given a list, and we're going to put those up there as well. Now, Timothy is the young evangelist, and you remember where he's at? He's at Ephesus. Now, Titus was left at Crete by Paul. He is an evangelist as well. He gives both Timothy a list of qualifications that shows that a man's ready to be a shepherd. And then in the Titus letter, we read that Paul says, I left you, we're in verse 1 and verse 5, or chapter 1, verse 5. I left you in Crete that you might set in order what remains and appoint elders in every city as I directed you. And then he gives the list of qualifications to Titus for appointing an elder. Now, all these qualifications answer the question, is this man ready to be a shepherd? Is he a mature Christian? And so when we look at these two, I want you to notice the similarities first of all, okay? And so I'm going to draw on this chart, and so I hope it all works out for you and you can see it clearly. But when we look at this, first he says an overseer. Well, that's what we're talking about, a shepherd or someone that is going to be serve as an elder in the church. There are similarities between the two lists. First of all, notice it says he must be above reproach, and that's also in Titus. I hope that comes across. Can you see that well, Sam? All right, good. Now, the second thing that is exactly the same, it says that in Timothy's account, he has to be hospitable right there. Well, we see that down there in Titus's list, hospitable, right? So they're exact equivalents. And then in verse 3 of First Timothy chapter 3, I love this word. It's a word that, well, it's fun to say, pugnacious. What is that? Well, we have the same word over in Titus chapter 1 and verse 7. There it is, pugnacious. So the similarities are obvious. But then we're going to notice there's a lot of things that are different. In fact, when we look at this all together, and we're going to erase all those things right there, when we compare the two lists together, I just want to make some observations. First, when you combine Timothy's list with Titus's list, both given by Paul, there's a total of 33 qualifications listed when you combine them. Some are the same and some are different. In fact, when we look at it, 6 qualifications, when you compare the two lists side by side, are exactly the same, only 6. But when we don't want to stop there. There are 4 that are very similar, and we could point those out later. But between the two lists, Timothy has 6 unique qualifications that Titus doesn't have in his list at all. And likewise, when you read Titus's list, he has 7 qualities, character qualifications that Timothy doesn't mention at all, even though some of them seem to be almost like, not quite the same, but maybe almost similar. But I'm just trying to point out they're different. They only share 6 exactly the same, 4 that are similar, so 10 only. And each of them have a half a dozen or more that are unique to themselves. So that means we have to ask a question. It just evokes some question, because if you were a casual reader of Timothy and you're got to this chapter about appointing elders and you read Titus afterwards, you would say they're different. And so let's ask just some obvious questions. And maybe you've never asked these, and so they'll be kind of new to you, but they're important that we ask. First question is this: could Timothy, receiving this letter from Paul while he's at Ephesus, could he appoint elders at the church at Ephesus using the list that Paul gave him? You understand the question? That's the only list that he has. You say, well, didn't he have Titus's list as well? You can't assume that. And if you assume that that's true, then you say, well, why didn't Paul give him both lists combined? He chose not to. So the only answer you'd seem to is reasonable, that if Paul sent Timothy this list of qualifications, he could use them to appoint elders. He could determine if someone is ready. The congregation could use this list to see if someone's ready, mature enough to be an elder. Well, could we ask the same question of Titus? He's on the island Crete, going to different cities, appointing elders in every church as directed by Paul. And Paul gave him a different list, had some similar qualifications, had some that are exact the same, but Titus has 7 character qualifications that Timothy doesn't have at all. Could Titus appoint elders using his list? Well, the answer is, of course, or else Paul has somehow hamstringed him or, disabled his ability to appoint elders if he doesn't have all the qualifications on his list that he needs to determine. So of course he could do it. So how are we going to harmonize this? We have 2 different men using effectively 2 different lists, appointing elders in different places. So the question we have to ask then, the last one, is why are there the differences? The reason I bring this up is because, well, it's apparent, and maybe you never asked that question. We need to harmonize it. And the answer is going to be found, no, there's not contradictions in the list, but we have to take a different perspective of what the qualifications are all about. So we could see that from a different perspective, we just back up a little bit, we can see that they both answer the same question. And what is the question? Is this man above reproach that we're considering? Is he ready to serve as a shepherd? And you could ask lots of questions to show that a person is mature enough. And so Timothy's list is not an exhaustive list, and that's obviously apparent because Titus has some things that Timothy doesn't. Titus's list is not exhaustive because obviously it doesn't have some of the qualification that Timothy has. It's interesting, neither of the list have all the fruits of the Spirit that are listed for us in Galatians 5. Now, wouldn't you think that those are necessary to show that you're mature, that you have love, joy, peace, self-control, those things? Now, some of them are mentioned, but not all of them. We see that in 2 Peter 1, there's a list of qualities. Add to your faith virtue, and virtue, what? Knowledge, and knowledge, self-control, all the way up to love and brotherly love. Love and brotherly love aren't even listed in either of the lists given to Timothy or Titus. How come? Aren't they a sign of a mature Christian? And I bring this out just to show they're not meant to be exhaustive lists of all the things you could ask of a person, but they are enough that to provide you with the information to answer our central question. What is that? Is this person ready to serve as an elder? So let's go back to our slide and just ask that question, because he said it's a fine work. And so an overseer, above all, he's got to be above reproach. We're going to suggest this is the central overriding qualification. Now, let's define the word, first of all, above reproach. It means literally, in a legal sense, it's not someone that you could apprehend and grab and take to jail in front of the judge because you have charges that you want to present against them that would stick. And so it literally means you cannot be laid hold of. So there's nothing that could be thrown against you, a charge or an accusation that would stick. So there's nothing in your personal life that you could pull up and say, oh, look at this. This man is not ready to be an elder because he's not above reproach. But when someone's above reproach, there's nothing you can accuse of them. Now, is he perfect? Of course not. But how do you test above reproach? Because it's a general word. It's kind of this generic term that's like an umbrella that encompasses so many aspects of his life. Well, each list does that. It addresses his personal life. It addresses his family life. It addresses his public life, and it addresses his spiritual life. It's interesting. Jesus grew in favor with God. That's spiritually. Jesus grew in favor with men. That's socially. He grew in favor and stature. That's physically. And so relationship to his own personal life. And Paul's addressing these things as well. But they give you a litmus test, each one of these qualifications, to show that a person is above reproach or not. And so again, that's the overriding qualification. Now notice when we look at the list again, we see him. Here he says, first of all, he must be above reproach. And Titus has the same thing. They're above reproach. In fact, Titus even repeats it when he talks about the family life of the man being considered to be an elder. He says, for the overseer must be above reproach. Why would he repeat the same qualification unless it's the overarching theme of how to answer the question? It's interesting, even when you look at the deacons, the similar qualification is getting above reproach. And then it gives them lesser things to test above reproachedness. It's a shorter list, but it's the same type of approach. So does that all make sense? We're answering a question. What does it take to answer the evaluation of this man? Is he ready to serve as a shepherd? And so when we look at his personal life, we're going to look at his family life, we're going to look at his social life, and then we're going to look at his spiritual life. All right. So we have a question. Go ahead. Oh, go ahead and ask it. That's fine.
Yeah, sorry, I was muted there. I was just bringing up the fact that somebody in the chat was just mentioning, one of the first things that you look for when you're, choosing who's going to be an elder is if they first and foremost desire the work to begin with. And I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Now, I addressed that real briefly. It's the idea of reaching out for someone as a goal. Some people put it as a list in the list of qualifications. I think it makes person a candidate. It's not a qualification. Yes, he has to desire it, or we wouldn't even be considering him. So he says, if a man desires the work of an overseer, he must be. The qualification comes after that phrase, if he desires it. So that's a presupposition. You have to desire it, or we're not even going to evaluate you. So it's not really one of the qualifications. Of course, it's absolutely necessary, because a person should not become elder because he was forced to. He should not become an elder because he felt like he had to. It's something he must desire. All right. So I hope that answers that. That's a good question, or a comment. All right. All right. Is it a question, Brad? Go ahead.
But just that there's probably some different pieces to this. Okay, there's probably some different parts to Titus and Timothy because they were different groups of people. I mean, Paul didn't say of Ephesus that they're all liars and they have a bad reputation, like he says in Titus in verse 12.
Right.
That Cretans, one of the Cretans once said they're always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons. This is so obviously there are some characteristics in Crete that he wanted to make sure were evident, that were necessary because of the general reputation of that area.
Now that's Brad, that's a good observation because it mentions that. And what are we going to do with that then? Either we have two types of elders, one that can serve at Ephesus and one can serve in the island of Crete, and they're different kind of elders, or else we're going to end up with the same kind of elder. You know what I'm saying? They're both qualified. They could serve in other places as well. But yet on the other hand, one man might be fit to serve in South Salem, but he'd go to maybe another community where they have a whole different culture, different scenario, and you might not be ready to serve there. And so there could be some differences that way. And then if you're bringing it out, that's, I think, exactly right. But we have the benefit of having both lists, and we combine them together and they help us understand each of them together. But the point is, we want to look at them as not as an exhaustive thing. You got to meet everything of these perfectly. And if you don't, you're disqualified, because the lists are different. And let's go through that and we'll try to explain how that is, because both of them contain negative personality traits and that you can't have. And some contain positive personal, spiritual character traits that you must have. So let's look at them with this idea in mind. All right. Anything else? Okay, good. Raise your hands. That's fine. We want to take it because it's supposed to be more of a class. So the first thing we're going to look at is in verse 2, or this group of words: husband of one wife, temperate, prudent, respectable, and hospitable. Now, when we look at the husband of one wife, there's a lot of discussion about it, but basically, if you look at it in the Greek language, you say, oh, do I got to know Greek? No, you don't. But it basically translates into it, he's a one man or one woman kind of man. So let me say that again. He's a one woman type of man. Now, what does that mean? He knows how to be faithful to one woman and one woman at a time. You say, well, why would you say that? Does he have to be married currently? That's not inherent in the language originally, because later in chapter 5, when we get to widows that need to be put on the list of a permanent benevolence, it uses the exact same language, but the genders are reversed. In chapter 5, verse 9, she must be the wife of one man. Wait, that's exactly what it says in 1 Timothy 5. Sam, you see a problem with that? If she's a widow and yet she must be the wife of one man, what's the problem? She can't be married currently if she's a widow. So what does that mean? She's a one man kind of a woman. She didn't get divorced and marry another guy. So it's a quality trait. It's a character trait that this man's ready because he's proven that he's known how to nurture his wife, become one flesh, grow old together, and to honor her as Christ, loved the church. That's really what he's talking about. And so say, well, what if his wife dies? Does he have to step down? Well, if we understand this, it's just a one overarching qualification above reproach. You just have to ask yourself, is he still, even though his wife died, is he still been proven to be a one woman type of man? You say, well, absolutely. He's been faithful to her. She now died. And that character trait doesn't go away because she died. And I know some people say, no, she has to be married. He has to be married to continue to serve. That's not in here in the text. But if that's necessary for a person to serve in a particular congregation, that's the way it's going to have to be. The man probably should step down. But I would ask people to take a careful look at it, because we're looking at his character. We're not qualifying the wife, we're qualifying the man. And nowhere in the text does it say the woman helps him serve as an elder. We impose that upon the text. All right, the next one. Temperate literally means sober, not intoxicated. So in other words, he's a sober-minded guy that doesn't have all these influences and agenda that's going to influence his judgment and his decision-making process. Coupled with that, these are all personal traits, right? He's prudent, and that is very similar, but he's balanced. In other words, he doesn't lean too much to the letter of the law, or he doesn't go over too much to, well, let's just follow the spirit of the law, which sometimes leads compromise. He's not legalistic. He's not liberal. He's balanced and prudent. He can make good decisions in regards to people and the work of the church and his own life. And now that's a sound mind. He's well balanced or sensible, some versions say. The next word is respectable. Notice in the Greek word that I have there beside it, and we'll just highlight it real quick. The word cosmos, I see that. That's where we get the word the world from. And so it literally means he's well ordered, he's well organized, and he's well prepared. In other words, he's grown spiritually, and he's taken care of. God has all his ducks in a row, if you would. We're not going to spend a lot of time on all these because we want to deal with them as a whole. The next group of words, well, first of all, hospitable. I will pause here. Sometimes words change over generations. Hospitable means to us is opening your house and being social, entertaining people, having people for dinner, having company over, playing games, and just entertaining people. And while that is good, it keeps us connected, and you would encourage people to do that. It's not what this word means. The word hospitable was a whole different thing in their day. And it literally means, if you look at that word philo, that means love of, like Philadelphia. Xenos is a stranger. And we have the word used in our political scene today, like xenophobia. That's someone that's scared of strangers or scared of someone of a different country or race. That word comes from this word xenos right here. But a philoxenos is a lover of strangers. He's someone that welcomes them and embraces them and brings them into his home when they need a place to stay because they didn't have a Hotel 6 or a Hyatt Regency to stay at. And so people were, especially when they're persecuted, Christians were traveling and had to escape persecution, and people would come in, you wouldn't know them, but since they wear the name of Christ, Christians would receive them into their homes, and mi casa es su casa, and what is mine is yours. That was the spirit of Christianity. He says this man has to have grown to be able to share what he has with those that don't. It's way beyond just being social. It's receiving and welcoming people as equals and meeting their needs. And sometimes there's a great urgency for that to happen. In our society, there's not a lot right where we live in Salem to take care of people. But that's what that word primarily means. All right, let's go to the next group. He says, able to teach, and that is really skillful in teaching. That's what it means. So teaching is not just the role of, well, a teacher or a preacher. It's a necessary qualification to serve as a shepherd, because, and it makes sense because you're going to feed the flock. So you got to be able to teach the flock. And the question is, how skillful do you have to be? Well, Titus is going to help us in this one. When we look at what he says in chapter 1 and verse 9 of Titus, let's read it together. And Brad already alluded to this. But when we look at it, see in verse 8, hospitable, same word we just looked at. Verse 9, holding fast the faithful word, which is in accordance with the teaching. He's got to know the word in a faithful way. He's got to understand it. Why? So that he may be able to both exhort in sound doctrine. That means to encourage and build people up. That's the positive. And also, here's the negative, so he can refute those who contradict. We already listed people that are going to teach strange doctrines, get caught up in speculations, doctrines of demons. An elder who's protecting the flock has to be equipped, knowledge with God's word. So not only can he identify false doctrine, he can refute it in a reasonable way that the person's convicted. Now that's the skill level you have to have. You don't have to be eloquent. You don't have to be able to stand up in public and preach or teach that way, but one-on-one or whatever it takes, an elder is supposed to be able to exhort using scripture and also refute those who contradict. He says, well, why? Because, well, verse 10, there are many rebellious men, empty talkers, deceivers. That means they lie, especially those of the circumcision. That'd be Jewish Christians. And he says, who must be silenced. Why? Because with their false teachings, their speculations, they're upsetting whole families, teaching things they should not teach for sake of sordid gain. And whose job is it to silence them? Yes, the evangelists, but here he puts it on the elders. And that's why they have to have this ability to teach, skillful in exhorting and sound doctrine and refuting those that contradict. Now that takes it perhaps along to a different area or a realm. I'll just tell one story with no names. I was in a congregation. I was teaching a high school class, and they were considering an older man, wonderful man, to become an elder. And when they're going through the qualifications, one of the questions came up from the congregation as they did this assessment. Well, is he apt to teach or able to teach? We've never heard him teach. So they said, well, that's legitimate. So they came to me and said, Jack, we want this man to sit in your class. And you're, mind you, I'm 19, 20 teaching teenagers. And we want him to observe what you're doing. And then we'll let him take over for the rest of the quarter. And that's exactly what happened. And now they said he's apt to teach. I'm going, really? That's all it takes? No, they didn't understand what we just read. Able to exhort in sound doctrine and to silence the false teacher. That's a skilled mature that is added, a mature man who's added to his faith knowledge. This man's ready to shepherd. And if he doesn't have it, he's not ready yet. He's not or above reproach. All right. I hope that helps, because it lofts the role or raises the role of an elder to maybe a higher place than we put it in just that aspect of all by itself. Let's look at the next ones then. Not addicted to wine. And there's that funny word, pugnacious, gentle, peaceable, and free from the love of money. The word not addicted to wine literally means one that doesn't sit by its wine. It was a problem then. It's a problem now. And an elder, because he's mature, has to be clear-headed at all times. So wine is not part of his personal character. The word pugnacious, it's a funny word, but it sounds like what it means. It's one that's ready to go to blows. He's contentious and he's always ready to fight. And Titus says you can't be self-willed. Timothy doesn't say it, but this word kind of alludes to it. He can't be a fighter. That's one that's always ready to quarrel with someone just so he can get his way. And that person couldn't serve as an elder. And when you look at him, does he make a good Christian? Always have to have his way in marriage. Always has to have his way with a relationship with brethren. And doesn't mean they can't grow out of it. We would just say they're not ready yet to be a shepherd. Work on this, Lord willing, that you become more gentle. That means equitable. You don't exact strict standards, over everything. It has to be just one way or my way or the highway. You're fair. And then this idea peaceable, and it's actually the word not a fighter. It's very similar to pugnacious, but it's a positive word. You're not this contentious person that's invincible. No, you can compromise when you need to compromise, and you know how to make peace. And blessed is the peacemaker. So see the contrast between a pugnacious person than one that's gentle and peaceable. He's a uniter rather than a divider. That person's ready to lead sheep, to keep the flock together, to be able to help it grow. And then, of course, a negative characteristic, he can't be a lover of money. That literally means someone that loves silver, just loves money. Again, that suggests, as we're going to see in chapter 5, elders can be paid or supported financially, just like a preacher. And because also an elder might be in overseeing some of the funds that are given to the church for benevolence or whatever, you can't have a lover of money. That was Judas, remember? Women were contributing to Jesus's ministry, and Judas kept the treasury box and he was pilfering it. He had a love of money. That man is not ready to shepherd. Can he grow out of it? Certainly. When he does his own self-assessment and looks at this, and he can make changes in his life. All right. The next one. He must be one who manages his own household well. Now, verse 4 and 5 are one qualification basically put together. And when we look at it, we have to understand it that way. And again, the overarching question is this man ready to shepherd? Well, let's look at his family. Did he know how to shepherd his family? And if he hasn't shown that ability, you think he's ready to shepherd entire family of God, the whole flock of children? So that's the question we're asking. He must be one who manages his own household well, keeping his children under control. The text says, with all dignity. Then the question's asked that we just asked. Paul asked, I took it from him. But if a man does not know how to manage his own household, how will he take care of the church of God? And the answer is obviously he can't. All right. So when we look at this, the word manage means to stand before. It can be used in any type of authoritative position, like a general might have, or a politician, or someone that's in charge. But it also speaks of a husband who's supposed to lead his family. He presides over, he gives care to an intention. All these words are used in, these terms are used in this word. They're inherent in it. He's not just presiding over, he's taking care of. Managing is a multifaceted thing. You're dealing with their physical needs, their spiritual needs, their social needs, trying to put a roof over their head, providing them food, but trying to get them to grow spiritually, and secular education. It's a lot in managing children, as you all know. All right. But when he does it, he has to do it with a certain dignified way. His children are under control. That really means submission. They submit to his leadership with dignity. That's where we get the word gravitas from. It's referring to in a weighty, dignified way, because they venerate or have some respect for their father. You've all seen it at the mall or the store, where the parents end up yelling at their kids, and sometimes just screaming at them. Johnny, I told you, you're going to get it as soon as. And then they look at you because they're kind of embarrassed. Said, oh, my children are just out of control. What's the real answer to that? No, ma'am, I'm sorry. You're out of control. Or, sir, you're out of control. Because raising the children is your job. And if they're unruly, that goes back to you. you haven't learned the skills to manage your children without yelling at them. They don't listen to you with dignity. They've learned that you have to scream at them and threaten bodily violence or something before they will obey. And even then they kick and scream. There's no dignity, or there's nothing dignified about it. We've all seen that. Well, that's one end of the spectrum. On this end, you got a father that he didn't have to lord himself over his children, but they respect him. And when he says to do something, they comply. And you go, wow, what great kids. Look at those kids. And they're usually bright and cheery and happy because they know boundaries. He's learned how to manage his children with dignity. Now let's look at Titus, because we're going to get some help from him on this. And it's interesting. He doesn't say in his list that Paul gave him that he has to manage his children. It's not there at all. All it says is, well, let's look at it, Titus chapter 1, when we look at the list that he has. Namely, verse 6, if he be a man above reproach, the husband, one wife, those are exactly the same, but having children who believe and not accused of dissipation and rebellion. There's nothing about managing, but it says children who believe. Now, that's often always understood is they have to be of age, that they are believers, they're Christians. And you say, well, yeah, that's what it says. Those children who believe. Well, that's interesting. So Titus going down and appointing elders in every church. And when he's evaluating the man that desires to be an elder, a shepherd, they look at him and say, well, do you have children? Yes. Doesn't have to ask if he manages them well. Well, it's kind of implied they're not accused of dissipation or rebellion. So it's there. But he does ask them, are they Christians? And that's Titus, right? Now, Timothy, you look at his list, he's going to go to a town or even at Ephesus where he's working as an evangelist or serving, excuse me. They're considering a man who aspires to be an elder. And they ask him, do you have children? Do you manage them well? And then, yes, he does. Are they dignified? Yes. Doesn't have to ask them at all if they're believers. He said, well, no, they have to be believers because Titus says that. No, whoa, that goes back to our question where we started. Could Timothy appoint elders without knowing about Titus's list, just with what Paul sent him? And the answer has to be yes, it was sufficient. So then how are we going to harmonize these two together? Well, the differences actually help us rather than hurt us. They help us understand these aren't exhaustive lists. They're just asking the overarching question, is he above reproach? Is he ready? And that's what is being said in 1 Timothy 3. If he can't take care of his own family, how's he going to take care of the children or the church of God? So let's make some sense of this. When we look at the word that is used here, it's the word pistos. I'll go right there to it. And it generally is defined in its proper sense as someone that's faithful. Faithful. But our question is, should it be translated believe, children that believe, as in is in Titus, or should it be translated faithful children? The word is pistis, and it can be translated both ways. But in Timothy, I just want you to notice how it's already used. Chapter 1 and verse 12. Paul said, God considered me faithful, so he put me into service. He wasn't a believer. He wasn't a believer at all. Jesus appeared to him and he became a believer, but God still considered him faithful. It's this word that is used in Titus 1, verse 6, for it's translated believe. In chapter 1, verse 15, he uses the word, it's a trustworthy statement. That's the New American Standard. But it actually is, it's a faithful statement. You can take it to the bank and count on it. It's the same word that Jesus used in Luke 16, where he says, you were faithful in a few things. you will be faithful in many. He doesn't say you believed in a few things, but you were faithful, you're trustworthy, you're a good steward. That's the predominant use of this word. It's a trustworthy statement. We see in chapter 3, it's a trustworthy statement if a man aspires to be an elder or an overseer. It's used right there in this text. And then chapter 3 and verse 11, he's got to be temperate, the deacon, faithful in all things. Doesn't say a believer. It's translated faithful, but it's the same Greek word. And then when we look at chapter 4, here it's used as a believer. We look in chapter 4 of 1 Timothy verse 3, men who forbid marriage, advocating abstaining foods, which God created to be gratefully shared by those who believe. These are actually believers then. It's used that way. But chapter 4, he goes back to the faithful use. Then this real quickly, look at Titus. There's our text, verse 6, children who believe. And then in verse 9, in the same chapter, it says the deacon or the elder must hold fast to the faithful word, same as exact Greek word. I'm just showing that it's used both to mean a believer, one that believes, but most often it's used to describe a person that's faithful. And so when we look at the word believe, how is it translated in most of the Bibles? The King James translates Titus chapter 1, verse 6, faithful children. The New King James says faithful children, not children that believe. The Christian Standard Bible, the Holman Christian Bible, Young's literal New Testament says faithful children. On the other hand, some of the major translation, the NIV says children that believe. The New American Standard, which I read, says children that believe. The English Standard, the American Standard, the Berean Bible, they all say children who believe. So our question is, which one most makes sense of the context? So let's look at it. He says he must manage his own household well. That's the overarching qualification. He's a good manager of his children, his family. Timothy says right here, look at that he keeps his children under control with dignity. And there's no mention of believing children here at all. But when we go over to Titus, Titus says right here, having children believe. But then he says, not accused of dissipation. My tongue's getting tied, or rebellion. Why are those words here? Because children that are living a life of righteousness or rebellion are not under control with dignity. They're the opposite of it. So this matches with this. Rebellion matches with being under control with dignity. So the question we have to ask, which properly fits Titus? Is it children who believe, or is it having faithful children, as the King James, the New King James, other translations have? This right here, rendering, most accurately lines up with what Timothy says, keeping his children under control. I hope that makes sense to you all. Now, in the end, it doesn't matter, because if a congregation has the understanding that the man being considered has to have children that are Christians, he couldn't serve unless he had believing Christian children. But if it was a congregation had a different understanding and it said, no, it's just faithful children. They could be under the age of Christians, or they could maybe just be teenagers or even young adults that haven't become Christians yet. But if they are submissive to their father in a dignified way, they meet the qualification. It's interesting, believing children. What if all his children die? Is he still qualified? Same question as what if his wife dies? Well, you say, well, of course. Well, no, it says he must have believing children. Is that current tense Whereas it shows his character. He proved that he's ready to shepherd because he shepherded his family. Now, if they all die, he still has proven that. You can't take that away from him. So let's go on and we can finish this. The last group of qualifications, not a new convert. That's where we get the word neophyte from. And Paul gives an explanation for that. He said, this guy's not ready to be a shepherd if he's a new convert. Well, why? Because there's a real danger to be conceited. Because power goes to people's heads. Authority does, control. The word conceited means literally smoke. You know, it's like the guy's head's in the clouds. He just thinks he's all puffed up and he thinks he's bigger than he really is. And that's what that word conceited means. And that happens. We see that people that get in control when they're not prepared for it or ready for it, it changes them. And they're not the peaceable, peacemaker, gentle person. They become, well, pugnacious and they weren't ready. So he says, not a new convert, so they don't become conceited or in fallen condemnation incurred by the devil. In other words, traps the devil's going to set for them. The next word is got to have a good reputation. This is really interesting because people can appear one way around one group, those in the church, especially at the few hours we see each other at services. You might not see them socially at all. And they can have one face, but then you learn by people that really know them, their extended family or people where they work with or people they recreate with, you learn a whole nother story, another side about their character. And sometimes, sadly, we hear things like when we say, oh, yeah, I know John, I'll just use, that's my brother's name. What's his name? Gilbert. There's no Gilberts. Yeah, I know Gilbert. And you say he worships with you? And I say, well, yeah, he's one of our elders. They go, he's an elder? I said, well, why are you surprised? And then they go on to say, you know, man, he swears, he's telling lies and dirty jokes. And you say, that actually happened? Yeah. Now, what do? How do we survey people that are outside at his work? I don't think you do that, but it's interesting. If you're going to hire someone for your job, for your business, you value your business enough, you'll ask for a personal reference and you will actually call that reference. And if the person got fired, you would ask why. We'll do it for money or for a job or our business. Maybe we should be a little more serious about it when we're trying to install a new shepherd who's going to lead us. And so when we look at this list, it's a fine work. It's so important. As we said, as the leadership goes, that's how the church is going to go. And as the teaching's going to go, that's how the church will go. That'll be in chapter 4. We'll talk about the teaching that has to come. But talking about a shepherd and overseer, it's a real fine work. It's to be highly esteemed. But that's why we have these qualifications, because it's so important. An overseer must be. There's no wiggle room on these things. He has to have proven himself as a mature man that has grown into the likeness of Christ. Perfect? No. But when he sins, he's willing to confess it and correct it and take care of it. He models how to do that for all of us. We need to see that. He models how to serve. He models how to teach. And that's what Paul is giving us when he has the list to Timothy and the same list to Titus. We get to put them together and gives us a real full understanding of what above reproach means. All right, there's our lesson. Any questions? We can unmute people and raise your hand, or if you got a question or a comment, if we raise something that you're just curious about too, that's fine. Okay, we're unmuting people, so if it's noisy, we're going to hear you, and that's fine. All right, I'll find Ann. Okay, Ann, go ahead.
From years back, other classes I've sat in on qualifications for elders, I remember a Bible quote saying, an elder needs to be easily treated. Does that ring a bell with you? Easy to be.
I don't have it. Sorry, someone, let's mute
Somebody have YouTube open in the background of their home.
Okay, we're going to mute everyone, then unmute Ann. All right.
There you go.
Okay, Ann, go ahead.
Okay, I've got in the back of my head from times gone by that in qualifications for an elder, there's a passage that in some translations reads, easy to be entreated. Does that ring a bell with you?
Yes. Yes. And that's a character quality, isn't it? That you can go to them and talk to them and you feel like you've been heard, and you can entreat them and you can ask for help. And that's a real quality, isn't it? Easily entreated. And so, yeah.
So a good listener is,
yeah.
that's a valid concern then. Thank you.
Yes. Yes. All right. Go ahead. Go ahead, Jeff, if that's you.
That's a valid concern then. Thank you.
Yes.
How do you turn the mic up?
Jeff, I hear you, and we're going to mute everybody else.
Volume?
Yeah.
Jeff or Marissa, did you have a comment or question? Right. I guess not. Anybody else? I'll ask them to start the video. Maybe that was it. All right. Well, good. Either we just did it perfectly or no one's got a question right now, or else everyone signed off already. We have 15 showing. Brad I noticed that Paul did not appoint elders when the congregation were first established. That's interesting too, probably because the men weren't ready. But on his first missionary trip, remember in Acts 13 and 14, he went up, established the church. On the way back, they appointed elders in every church. So I don't know how much the time frame was, but they were obviously men that were ready then. Good point. Brittany, I got one. Okay, Brittany, let's unmute her. Go ahead. Hey, Brittany, go ahead. Or Jordan, whoever it is.
Hey. So my question was, when it's going over the qualifications for an elder, it uses, when it talks about children, it uses plural language. Is it a requirement to have 2 or more children that are ordained?
That's a great question. And that's one that's often debated a lot. And I think the debate is a consequence of not understanding first the role of an elder, and then the intent of the qualifications. The intent of the qualifications are to show that this guy's ready to shepherd. He's above reproach. Now, why does that change the children question? Because some people say, no, you have to have multiple children because children's in the plural. Well, we don't talk that way, because I'll just demonstrate. Jordan, do you have any children? No, Jordan, do you have children?
I know it's a loaded question.
Is that it? That's a yes or no. Do you have children?
I have a child.
But does that qualify as children?
Not in the sense that children is a plural word.
But see, we use children as both singular and plural.
Yeah, in English, I guess. So would you have to look at the Greek translation?
It's the word teknon. No, is that right? No,
I don't know.
We have to look it up. But it doesn't have inherently singular or plural. And so when he's talking in a broad way, you have to have children. That means 1 or more. You qualify.
And this might be kind of a proof text argument, so take it with a grain of salt, I guess. But the widows, when Paul's outlining widows and the ones to take care of, it says if they have children, then they're supposed to take care of their widowed mother. And so we don't look at that and assume, well, she only has 1 child, so therefore, he doesn't, you know what I'm saying? There's some flexibility with that word there, as far as children, whether it's plural or singular.
Right. Did you get that? That's in chapter 5, verse 4. If any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to practice piety or payback. In other words, before the church takes care of that widow, her children does. Does that mean she have to have 2 or more? No, one child. It falls on that child and not the church. See what I'm saying?
I have a follow-up question on that.
Sure.
Um,
It's a
so
great question because it's debated a lot, and I think unnecessarily so. But go ahead.
Well, because of the whole rule of loving your brother, and if you have one brother that believes that it is children plural, then would you be disqualified because of that, and or would you be less likely to be picked because of that?
That's a good
to
question.
not be unloving to your brothers?
That's a great question, and it's in our study tonight. You've probably heard me say once or twice that one man might be able to be an elder here, but not somewhere else. And that's great because that's a local autonomy. And it might be over an issue about just like this. Because if one congregation thinks, no, you have to have multiple children and everyone has to be a Christian, not one of them can fall away, then a person couldn't serve there if he only had one. Well, he might be able to serve here if the consensus was one child qualifies you. Do you see the difference? And that's okay because we can have autonomy and there's no creed book that details, every rule here, because we're just looking for, here's a man in our congregation, our flock. We know he's ready to shepherd us. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess. What would be your recommendation? Because that's an office that I desire, and I'm kind of actively preparing myself for that office in the future. Obviously, I'm very far away, but would you think it to be wise to have a second child just to avoid the whole situation?
Well, I could say, joke, yeah, get busy and have a couple more. But to answer your question honestly, I don't think it's necessary, but prove yourself, have multiple children. They're a blessing from God. Go ahead.
Well, and I was
Sam.
just going to add, I think it is always better if you have more, because if you have, one child that is, faithful in serving God, okay, that's great. That's one thing. But what happens if you have 5 children that are faithful in serving God? That really speaks to your character. So I think certainly I wouldn't look at it as a requirement to have more, but whether it or not people look at that and see that as speaking to your character and perhaps qualifies you even more, then I would say, there's some wisdom and validity to that.
A true life story. We know of a man who was an elder and his daughter fell away from the faith. And so he resigned because of that. He only had one child.
So what if you have, say, 5 children and only 4 of them are believing?
See, that's another.
All of them believe?
Yeah. See, that's another question that's argued. And because, and I think unnecessarily so when we understand the overarching qualification, is this man ready? So he has 5 kids, 4 of them are Christians. One hasn't become one yet. Has he proven himself? That local congregation has to answer that question. And it'll either be an obvious yes, or there'll be a lot of doubt. If there's a lot of doubt, he's not ready yet. So there's no fast rule. Now he might go to another congregation and he'd be ready because they have a different, understanding or feel about it all. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that's okay. Because if the man insists on being an elder, then he's self-willed. Just like when an elder's wife dies, if that congregation thinks he cannot serve anymore because he no longer meets that qualification, it doesn't matter if he thinks he can. If he insists on continuing to serve, he's not qualified immediately now because now he's self-willed and contentious.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's overarching. It's more about the character rather than all the little details that we like to, sometimes argue about and churches are divided about. But if we look at it, it's just a character test. I think it becomes easy. Hey,
Jeff and Marie, wow, I can't talk. Jeff and Marisa, all right, we unmuted you. Let's try that again. We can hear you.
Okay. Can you hear us?
yeah,
Yep,
good. You're on.
Oh, I think you answered it really well with what Jordan was asking. Those are really good questions. And so often we do spend so much time trying to ways to disqualify men. And I've
Yes.
Yeah.
seen every single scenario that you just went through and that Jordan just asked, where I've seen some men who do have 4 or 5 kids and maybe only 1 or 2 are faithful. And yet he may be really a strong candidate opposed to a man who maybe only have 1 or 2
Yeah.
children. And they're
Good
both of
point.
those kids maybe both be faithful. It really does depend on the congregation a lot. I know a congregation right now that have qualified men, but that congregation feels that all of your children have to be faithful always.
Currently, no matter if they're
All your
50 or
children,
60. Yeah.
all 3 of your kids, all have to be faithful always. And
Mhm.
they don't have an eldership right now. And so when you see certain qualifications held to maybe an extreme, in my opinion, to where you don't get a qualified eldership, you might want to go back and check. In
Yeah.
other words, hey, am I pulling something too strong? Am I missing something out of context? But the 23 qualifications are a verb tense. So they're current and future tense. They're a noun and a verb. So that means that they're ongoing. So once you go in, it doesn't mean they always go away. But within that, it just depends. In other words, when you go in, you must have faithful children and you must continue to have faithful children. But it depends. There's extreme cases where your
Sure.
children do die and maybe you did meet that qualification and you were a husband and one wife, but she has passed on.
Yes.
So there's just a lot of judgment in some of those, but you're really looking at the overarching, and Jack did a really good job making that a point tonight.
Yeah. Good. And these questions are good. And we need to talk about them ahead of time because then when the scenario does arrive, we're already prepared. And
I
so
was
we
just gonna
never want to
say-
minimize them. But again, I have to warn us beginning too nitpicky on every little detail because then we miss the overarching approach. Because, hey, the lists are different. Timothy does not even say believing children. And we have to deal with that. Does that make sense with
Yeah,
everybody that's listening?
I was
Yeah.
going to say, too, with the question you're answering there with Jordan was the word actually does mean singular or plural. So in the
Yes.
wording of the Greek and the Hebrew and the Jewish times, they use that word synonymously. It can mean singular or plural. So when it says, do you have faithful children? It can mean just, do you have any faithful child? And we don't talk that way, but that's what that originally does mean. But again, there are congregations that may be uncomfortable with that.
That's right. And that's important to always make that they, each congregation is going to have to work this out on their own. Mark had his hand up. Did you have something to say, Mark?
Yeah, I think that it sort of kind of got answered along the way. Again, because generally, the person that you're going to probably put up for an elder generally is going to be, well, obviously not somebody in their 20s or 30s, but somebody that has life experience.
Yes.
In some cases, they're going to be old enough where their children have moved out and they're gone. And so the children are leading their own lives. Okay. And at that point, if the children are out of the house and living on their own and fall away, would some people, come back and say, okay, well, he's got children that are fallen away, but, he may have raised them well, but they're not living with him and they're no longer Christians. Would he still be held accountable at that level?
And that's a great question and observation. And that's another thing that's debated. The question I would ask, are they in his household when they have left and they're adults and they've been Christians outside the house for 10, 15 years, then they fall away? I don't care if it's just 5 years. The question I would say, he manage his children well? Did they listen and obey him with all dignity while they're in the household and while there's a continuing relationship? Yeah.
Well, whether they're Christians or not.
Yeah.
Did they, like I said, and that's why I said, I think that my question kind of got answered with some of the other questions that were asked, related to that. So, where it talks about just managing the household and that exhibit, that wasn't mentioned in all cases.
Yes.
So yeah, I think you answered my question. Thank you.
Good. All right. Glad you spoke up.
I just have a comment. I think it's interesting and appreciate all the comments, but you look at it and it seems like every question and everything that we've talked about, it has to do with the children. You know what I'm saying? And I know we have lots of questions about that, and those are all valid questions that we should ask. But it seems like also when we're evaluating elders, it becomes more about the children than it becomes about the man.
Yes.
And I think that, let's ask the questions that, again, I appreciate everybody's questions a lot, and they're questions that need to be answered. I'm not discounting any of that. But also let's make sure that when we come around to that evaluation process again, let's look at the children, but let's not only look at the children.
Because it is about the man. That's right.
Yeah.
Ann or Heather, did you have a question? You have to unmute you. I see you. Go ahead.
Okay, you can hear me?
Yes.
Well, two questions. I'll try to make them quick. The first one is, why doesn't it say that the man has to have a believing wife? And could a man become an elder without a believing wife?
Wow.
Wow. That is a great question. I don't think I've ever had that asked or even considered it. Leave it to my daughter.
Yes.
So yeah, so did you get a hold of the plumber? And
Oh, wait, Mark, we need to mute
You
you.
need to mute
Firefighter Mark, thank you.
Mark.
There we go.
All right, he's gone.
I think
I'm not going to answer that until I give it some chance to think about it, because you're right in your observation. Paul didn't state that, and to either Titus or Timothy. It just seems like it's always understood that the wife would be a believer, but that's a presupposition we've brought into the text. It doesn't say that necessarily, but unless someone else has a comment on it, I'd rather choose to think about that before I give you an answer.
Brilliant question.
Yeah.
It is a good
you,
So-
hey, Jack,
Yes.
why don't you go back to, your overlying arches, right? Your concept, unequally yoked, marriage principles, example, how
Right.
you're going to lead. You'd go through a process of concept and principle, even though there may not be an absolute, right? It doesn't say thou shalt not have a piano. We look at what are the principles of singing and making melody in our heart. So it'd be that same type of proofing text, proof it by example, right?
Except for, especially in Paul's day when he's evangelizing, people are already married when he goes on his missionary trips, and he's converting people, and not always the spouse was converted. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 14. So I could see that the scenario that the man is converted and is devout and raises his children well, and his wife never becomes a believer. So it's a good question. I don't have an answer for it right now, but I would lean to where Jeff's saying, but what's your other question, Heather?
Okay, yeah.
Sorry.
I don't know if this would be for next class, but I'm wondering what your understanding of paying elders is. When should a congregation pay their elders?
Okay, that's a good question. That'll be chapter 5 and verse 12. So that's 2 or 3 classes from now. And hopefully we're in the building by then, but that's a good one. But real quickly, it says, to answer your question, verse 17 of chapter 5, I'm sorry. Let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor. The first honor is just the honor that they're supposed to get, the high esteem for their work. The second honor is financial support. And I apologize, I said the word hire. We don't hire elders. We don't hire preachers. We support them in their work. He says, those especially who work hard at preaching and teaching. We would understand that these men are not just only shepherding, they're probably working as a preacher as well, publicly, or evangelizing as well. And so that's why he says in verse 18, the scripture says, you shall not muzzle the ox while he's threshing, the labor is worthy of his wages. That's how we know it's speaking about honoring him with financial support. But we'll deal with that one more deal later.
Yeah, I want to circle back to Heather's question because I actually think that we can answer that somewhat definitively. And this is actually to my dad's credit because he texted me. He's watching and he texted me. But yeah, but
David Bray did?
yeah, he
Hey,
did.
David, why don't you be brave and get online and say it for yourself?
Yeah, he's on YouTube. He's probably on YouTube.
Oh, I'm just having fun with you.
But when you look at the qualifications for deacons, I think that we can infer and probably would universally agree that whatever qualifications apply to deacons should also apply to elders because elders are in a higher office, so they're held to an even higher standard.
Mhm.
And so when you go to 1 Timothy 3, you drop down to verse 11. It says, their wives likewise must be dignified, not slanderers, but sober-minded, faithful in all things. To me, that kind of answers that question.
Well, she could be faithful in all things and still not be a believer.
I think
Is she,
study that
whoa.
word. I
We'll
think
have that discussion, and because I don't want to go on record of saying one thing or the other.
Yeah.
But that's a good point, though.
Yeah.
I'll give you that one. Thanks, Dave Bray, for helping us on that. All right. See, we're a West Coast thing now. We're bigger than just South Salem.
I
All
think
right.
he's
Anybody
right.
else got something?
I think he's right, Jack. When you study that word, because you talked earlier about elders, wives not having qualifications, there actually are some, and that verse is one of them. Faithful in all things. I think if I'd be curious what you find out. I'm not going to go
Yeah.
on record either, but
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that word and some other principles do go into her being a faithful person,
Yeah.
a spiritual way.
My gut says yes, that they have to be a Christian, but I just, again, don't want to be presumptuous. But Brad Simmons, go ahead. Where is he? Oh, there you are. I'm going to highlight you.
Just getting back a little bit to what Heather said, but I had something other than that. Part of it is culture, and yes, there were husbands with wives who were unbelievers and so forth, but the role of the women, perhaps, and again, this is just an opinion, so you can, if you don't like it, throw it out.
Yeah.
The women did not have that much authority. They were to do whatever their husbands led and said to do.
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps that's one reason there's not that much mentioned. Getting back to the hospitable, what came to mind back there early when we were going through that was the lawyer that came to Jesus and asked
Yes.
the greatest commandments. And when it came to the second one about loving your neighbor as yourself and said, who is my neighbor? The first two Jews were not hospitable.
Yeah, it's a good example.
The Samaritan that came through proved to be hospitable.
Yeah, very much so. That's
So
a great
when we talk about
example of that.
hospitality here in the New Testament, that's what it's talking about, is
Yeah.
loving our neighbor as ourselves, being hospitable,
Yeah.
taking care of the stranger.
Yeah, another good example is when he sent the 12 out and the 70 out. He said, don't bring gold or silver. Just go into the house. And if they receive you into the house, you let your blessings be there. That's hospitality. If they don't, shake your feet off and protest against them. So yeah, very good. Good. Anybody else? Oh, go ahead. You done?
Just, and I don't know if the man was an elder in the congregation or not, but long time ago, I had gotten my first job out of college, and I had to go to the Oakland, a little east of Oakland, the Walnut Grove area of California.
Mm-hmm.
I was there for 2 weeks. And so I look up and go, oh, there's a congregation here in this area. So I call them and say, I'd love to come worship, but I don't have transportation. So an older couple, I was a stranger, came, picked me up, took me to services, took me to lunch afterwards, took me to see the sights.
Nice.
The whole shebang, as I say,
Yeah.
and
Yes.
then give me a ride home.
That's nice. And that's what, yeah, I think it's more of that. Even there's a lot of social in that, but they're meeting your needs of service. That's great. Good. I appreciate all the input and questions, because that's what makes Zoom so special. We can do this. Even though we're not together, we can still do it. Anybody else? Anybody else? If not, we're going to probably wrap this up. And next week we'll talk about deacons. And I'm going to stop the live stream right now. So thank everyone that is on YouTube. Have a good night. And Lord willing, 12:30 Friday, we're having excuse me, no more Brents. Steve Finley from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, the evangelist there. And then Bill Downing from Fort Scott, Kansas. We're going to talk about how could we jumpstart the church when we get back together, and what are they doing as new evangelists because they both moved to their receptive areas. So that was 12:30 Friday. Okay, and you can go on Zoom and or live stream as well. And then, of course, if not, we'll see you Sunday during our service. All right. So goodbye to those on YouTube.